Hello, good morning. Today we're going to be moving on to our protest and change unit. Last class you looked at the timeline of events from this era. This is the 60s and 70s. It is marked by big social changes that had happened in the United States. When we learned back in the revolutions, the Industrial Revolution era, we talked about social change, but we also talked about regulation, business change. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the era, the next few weeks, really. We're going to be focusing on the era where there was huge social changes. It's focusing on the way that humans interact with other humans within our society. It's going to have to do with some laws, but mostly it's going to be Americans fixing what is wrong with America. Okay, we go back to that Bill Clinton quote. In his first inauguration, he says, "There is nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what is right with America." So let's look at this era, 60s and 70s, to be talking about how Americans came together to fix problems that they saw in themselves. So we'll begin this by talking about the two main presidents during the 60s and 70s, and this is going to be Kennedy and Johnson. Now, JFK, okay, is going to be the first president that we're talking about today, Kennedy. Okay, so Kennedy was young, he was hip, he was cool, and when he became president, he was in this close, tight race with Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon at the time had a lot more of a political experience to it. He had a long-standing political experience. He was a war veteran from World War II, and this is going to be the first time presidential debates were put on television, because this is the first time televisions are that popular of enough Americans to have them in order to project something like this. Up until this point, it had just been radio. And there's this old adage that you have a face for radio, meaning that you're not so pretty. And Nixon was never known as a pretty man. But on the flip side, JFK, that's kind of what he's remembered as, this beautiful, young, suave man that is everything that is the American dream at this time. So you have JFK, gorgeous, on TV, and you have Richard Nixon, who looks like everybody's grandfather. And during these debates, he actually has a cold. So he's sweating, he's coughing, the makeup he has on is starting to droop. It's not pretty. And a lot of Americans, really, historians, talk about how TV played the deciding role in this election. Now, this was one of the closest in US history. The main criticism of JFK was actually that he was Catholic. Americans thought potentially that he would just get his guidance from the Pope over in Vatican and in Italy instead of determining his own ideas. So that was actually a thing. People really thought that was going to happen. It didn't happen. So JFK, is going to win this presidency. Nixon later on after Johnson will win presidency. So he doesn't give up. He keeps running. JFK is going to now be the youngest president in US history. So here's some pictures from that debate. Okay, you have up here. Here's some of the parades, and you can see people came out just to wave at him. He would campaign openly in convertibles, which we'll talk about a little bit later if you don't already know about history. So yeah, here's campaign pen. You can see how the electoral votes kind of broke down overall. Now, when he became president, he wanted to better the United States reputation. He wanted to make our name something positive. And he knew to do that, he's going to be helpful. Okay, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. So he's going to be looking for the third world. Now, the third world used to be a descriptor word that we would talk about, that we would use for poor nations. Okay, that was the name for poor nations. Today, it's not considered politically correct Though a lot of people in our politics still do use that term, it's not considered politically correct, and it has been removed from textbooks as a proper moniker. You probably remember back from geography, if you took geography, that we don't use that. We say, areas of development or countries, developing nations. We not underdeveloped, but developing nations, and that is kind of what we call them now. But his was third world. He wanted to create the Peace Corps, which still exists today. The idea is American volunteers, typically they're college age or post-college age volunteers. They are supported, meaning that their way is paid, to go and help countries that don't have the ability to help themselves. So construction work, building of schools, teaching, medical aid, building sewer systems, building water canals, building wells, these types of assistance that can be done. And it's still a project today. It's still a corporation, a way to help the world today if you are so interested once you are considered an adult. He also created the Alliance for Progress for Latin America. Most of Latin America was developing nations during this time, and he is going to promise and provide economic assistance, but he's only going to be providing it for countries that are not communist. So this is going to play into that Cold War strategy as well. The program was a complete failure because oftentimes this money would go into very restrictive governments, or it went to fund cartels in a lot of places, and it was then criticized and eventually just all fell apart. Okay, so you see some pictures here of Peace Corps. There's some of the advertisements. On the bottom there are some murals and some big banner that is, you can see Kennedy down here going around and campaigning for his progress. Now, other Cold War strategies, he wanted the United States to be ready to fight if anything came up. Korea had already happened, and we saw that Korea, we really weren't very well prepared for fighting. And he is going to coin, JFK is going to coin the term flexible response, meaning the United States military needs to be ready for whatever type of environment and whatever type of fighting that it's going to happen. If it's going to be in the Arctic, we better be trained for the cold. If it's going to be in the jungle, we better be trained for the heat, for the exhaustion, for whatever. If it's going to be on the beaches, like we saw in World War II, we better have amphibious assaults. And he's going to create specific special forces that we still have today, like the Green Berets. Green Berets are very famous for being parachute combats. The Navy SEALs, the Army Rangers, those types of specialized military forces are going to be created under him. The Bay of Pigs is going to be something that happens under JFK. Bay of Pigs was the United States attempt to remove Fidel Castro in Cuba. Cuba is 90 miles away from the United States. All right, at its closest, we did not feel comfortable having communism that close to our borders. So he is going to instruct the CIA to orchestrate a removal of Fidel Castro. And to do this, they're going to invade using Cuban exiles. So Cuban nationals were going to be funded and equipped and sent to Cuba. And their goal was to storm Havana and remove Fidel Castro from power. This is going to be completely a failure because when those invaders that we told, hey, go, get to the shore, there wasn't any American backup waiting for them. In fact, it kind of completely fell apart, and most of those invaders were either killed upon capture or were then killed once they were captured. And Kennedy did accept responsibility for the utter and complete failure and ineptitude of that mission. And Fidel Castro looked like the victor. He took this victim role and then said, look, I've overcome. America can't touch me. America can't touch Cuba. We're stronger than this winner of 2 world wars. And he is, inept. That's kind of how he saw it. And it put a larger strain on Cuban-United States relationship. Now, another issue that is going to happen here is going to be that the Cuban Missile Crisis is going to start under JFK. And United States surveillance cameras through aerial photography is going to discover that the Soviets had a nuclear missile site in Cuba. And with being that close, that's going to be close enough to hit the United States in major cities without ever knowing. Okay. No warning, just boom, flash, done. And a lot of Americans were really preparing for that during this time. So Kennedy is going to order a quarantine of Cuba and going to send out the United States Navy to prevent any of those nuclear warheads to come into Cuba to be armed into the missiles. And it was this tense standoff where really a lot of Americans stopped going to work, they stopped going to school, they were hiding in bunkers, they were stockpiling. Okay, you think there's no toilet paper now? It was really bad then. They were stockpiling food and equipment because they really thought that at any moment there was going to be this nuclear war and they were going to be blown out of their homes. It lasted for about 13 days. And in the end, the United States made a deal with Cuba to detente, okay, to alleviate the worst of this Cold War tension. And the way they did that is they set up a hotline. They went from tensely not talking in the Cold War to having a system of direct communication between Moscow, the capital of the USSR, and Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. And in that hotline, that direct communication, the leaders of our countries decided that the United States would remove their nuclear weapons from Turkey, which is right next to the USSR, and the Soviet Union would then remove their missiles from Cuba, which is right next to the United States. So they made a compromise and a deal to kind of remove their nuclear weapons from right next to each other. There's been many, many movies of it. You can see this is where that quarantine naval blockade was during there. And then here is kind of seen as where those missiles could have reached. Now within this circle, that means that those missiles could have reached within no warning. Okay, just boom, flash. We didn't even know they fired the missiles. Over here, you can see the larger of the radius, and within there, the missiles could have hit. So really, they could have hit DC without us even knowing, could have hit New York, at least would have known about it. And those are our two major centers at this point in time. Now, Kennedy, as president, his whole system, his administration was often referred to as Camelot. Okay, King Arthur and his bride Guinevere from fabled mythical tale were the perfect. He created this region and this area of power and peace in a time of chaos of the Middle Ages. And the administration, the Democratic Party, pushed that he was King Arthur, creating a system of peace in a time of chaos. And he had his perfect wife, and he had his two gorgeous little children, a girl and a boy, and they were all happy, perfect American white bread family. And they were open and accommodating, and they gave, and Jackie Kennedy gave a taped tour of the White House. This was welcoming and better homes and gardens and perfect Stepford wife family. And so it really charmed a lot of Americans, and it made Americans feel good about the moral ethics of this family, and they were the idyllic family of what every family should be: dinners together and all of this welcomeness and the lovingness of the wholesome family during that time. Now, King Arthur, in the fable tale, had the Knights of the Round Table, meaning he didn't sit at the head of the table. He incorporated himself, the round table. The knights had an equal share, equal say in being in the room. And JFK did go out of his way to find the best Secretary of State, not just the person that's going to suck up the most. And he did go out of his way to find the best accommodations and the best advisors for those positions. So here's some pictures of the Kennedy family. As president, domestically, that means within the United States, he did increase the already established minimum wage. That wasn't a federal minimum wage, but it was loosely regulated. He did extend Social Security benefits carried over from the New Deal era. He passed an Equal Pay Act. Now, an Equal Pay Act is going to be for women. Okay, he's going to push that if you have the same contract for a man and a woman, the contract should read the same amount of money. Now, that just made more loopholes that people went around, but it was a step in the general good direction. He also was going to try and jumpstart the economy with deficit spending. Basically, even though the United States did not have the money on hand, they went ahead and spent money. The government spent money because they knew that it was coming to them in taxes later on. They could see that, okay, well, in a few months, we're going to have this much taxes collected. So we'll just go ahead and spend it now because we know we're going to have it later. And it did push the economy a little bit. When it comes to civil rights, Kennedy did have big ideals, and we know this from his memoirs, we know this from his journaling, his private meetings. We know that he wanted to end segregation. We know that he wanted to create some type of equality amongst races. Now, some types, not full equality. He really didn't understand what full equality is, being a white man from Massachusetts that was raised wealthy and really didn't understand the plight of other ethnic groups. But he had an idea and had some goal to try and improve it greatly. Now, so he did see the government as the need to change those civil rights problems, mostly segregation. But he wanted to be elected a second time. So he was very timid, very slow to push that part of the agenda. And when he needed to back it up federally, he did step up to maintain protections, federal protections that were already in existence, but he was very timid and did not change any existing laws to benefit. But a lot of Americans knew, and a lot of historians really see it as, if he was to do a second term, he definitely would have gone in full force into civil rights era. Okay, so here is your review. Now moving on, we have our space race, our assassination, and we have a brand new president going through this era. So the space race, this came out of Cold War. The idea of the Cold War is the United States versus the Soviet Union, and they are going to battle each other politically and scientifically. In 1957, the USSR launched the first satellite, world's first satellite. First ones, they win. The United States, not to be outdone, is going to then try and get another satellite up there. And this kicks off this race to who can have the best space technology, the best rocket technology. And the United States declared that the winner of this race will be the first one to put a human on the moon. And it wasn't just the United States, it was JFK, okay? He famously, in his first few months as president, says, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard, with his Massachusetts accent, and it is completely different when not me says it. But he says, we're going to be on the moon before the end of this decade. So he even says, we're doing it this decade, it's getting done. And it kickstarts. For a few years, the United States definitely did lag behind the USSR. The USSR had that first satellite, Sputnik, okay? The USSR is going to be the first one to send a man into space, okay? So a man out of our atmosphere into space. They are also going to be the first group to send up a manned mission that goes all the way around the Earth, orbits the Earth. They got it first. Okay. Now, meanwhile, the United States is keeping up in a second. Okay. They sent the first satellite. We then were able to send satellites. They sent a man up into the space. We then sent a man up into space, Alan Shepard. Okay. And then they sent a man to orbit the Earth, and then we're going to send our first man to orbit the Earth. That's John Glenn. Okay, John Glenn is going to be going on and being a lot more space missions. So is Alan Shepard. So here's Goering. Goering is the first man to ever be in space. Okay, he is a Russian cosmonaut. Here's what Sputnik looked like. Okay, it really was just a metal volleyball with little antenna on it. It went up, it went ping, ping, beep, beep, and then it fell. So here is the pictures there of the space missions. We have Alan Shepard and we have John Glenn in their tinfoil suits. Now, Kennedy is going to commit us. Remember, we choose to go to the moon. And on July 20th, 1969, we are the first country to land humans on the Earth. We are going to then continue to send 10 more people onto the moon. So we have a total of 11 people on the moon. There is one astronaut that goes twice. So sometimes they say 12, but there was 12 footsteps on the moon, but one of those people were double mission. So really there's only been 11 people on the moon, and they're all American. Okay, no other country in the world has ever sent humans to the moon, mostly because they see it as pointless. And that's kind of why the United States has stopped sending Americans, because they have focused on other options and other ways to spend money to explore and experiment. So Cape Canaveral, once Kennedy was killed, is going to be renamed to Cape Kennedy. Since then, it has been renamed again. Now it is Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral. So yeah, they took that away. Yeah. Moving on. Since I've already said that he dies, JFK dies. He's assassinated. November 22nd, 1963. He is campaigning in Texas because he had already defended civil rights, and so he knows that he needs to go down into the South, into the deep South, and glad hands, shake some hands, kiss some babies, make some friends, make some voters. And while campaigning there, he is going on a parade through Dallas, and 3 shots ring out. 2 of them are going to hit JFK. 1 is going to hit his driver. JFK is hit in the neck and in the back of the head and is killed in the car. He's dead. There is no resuscitation. It's not like Lincoln, who didn't die till the next morning. This was dead. There are videos of it. I refuse to show videos of it because that's someone's dad and grandfather, and I'm not showing that. Anyways, but you have Google if you really want to see someone die, whatever you're into. The Warren Commission is then set up by the government to make sure that Lee Harvey Oswald is the only shooter. So they go through all of the information and they disclose all of the information, not all of it, some of it, most of it, a lot of it's redacted. It's the government. And it shows that they determined that Oswald was the only shooter. There are some theories that there was more than one shooter, that no one person could make that all 3 shots essentially from that far away. Oswald was a Marine sniper. The United States trained him to make those shots. He was good at what he did. And so he did. JFK was later buried at Arlington Cemetery. He has, his tomb has the eternal flame, and you can visit it. There's what it looks like there. Okay. Immediately following the announcement of his death, a doctor declares him dead. Johnson, his VP, is going to be sworn in as president, and that's what you see in this picture here. There's Johnson, and there is Jackie Kennedy with her husband's blood still on her jacket as she's being sworn in there. This picture here is JFK's son, also known as John John. That was his nickname. He salutes his dad's casket at his funeral. It is a tradition to have the military full casket through Washington D.C. upon a president's death, and him being only 3 did not understand it all. Just saw everybody saluting, and he salutes, and so that is the history of that picture there. Let's talk about Johnson as president. After JFK's death, Johnson is going to be sworn in because that is the right of secession according to the United States Constitution. He sees it as his mission to finish what JFK wanted in JFK's term. And Johnson is going to stick to exactly what JFK had already talked to him and spoken to him about accomplishing. And one of those things was civil rights. So within that era, that last year as JFK's presidency, he is going to push through not only the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but very shortly after, he's going to do the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 formally, federally outlaws discrimination based off of race, religion, sex, or national origin in any public place or place of employment. Okay, so this does not guarantee the prohibit of discrimination in a private company, all right, in a private building, in a private ownership, unless you are an employee of that organization. Okay, so that's your employment based. So they can't discriminate you if you're employed. If you're a customer, they can. Okay, there's nothing legally against it, and it can't be in a system of government, public place. Okay. Now, this is also going to pass the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, meaning that they have to hire people. They can't discourage hiring people because of any of those of religion, race, sex, or national origin. Since then, they have gone back and amended that to also sexual preference, sexual identity. Okay. All right, so when Johnson becomes president, he is going to declare a war on poverty. Okay, it's always great for a president to declare war on something that is inanimate. Okay, because there's no one to really argue that you lost, and there's no real strategy of winning. But he wants to really focus on the Americans that need the most help, and he's going to do this by spearheading programs to focus on education, on job training, which is education in a way, and healthcare. Okay, that's going to be the big thing. Okay, and he sees it as this is the rights of all humans. You should be able to educate yourself, and you should be able to be healthy, and you should be able to make money. Okay, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, and so he's going to focus on that. Give job training where it's needed. He's going to create VISTA, which is like Peace Corps, but for the United States. And then he's going to continue what Kennedy wanted in that one. Johnson is going to run for re-election, and he is going to hands down win, absolutely landslide winning of this election. And mostly it's because he was winning on the thumbs up of the Kennedys, and Kennedy went out as a hero, as most assassinated presidents do. Okay? You don't speak ill of the dead. And then as president, so as an elected president, Johnson is going to create what he sees as his Great Society. These are his programs. And it's going to be the same kind of Great Society is going to be very similar to the War on Poverty, but it's just him as president now. He's going to focus on healthcare, elderly and poor, okay? Focus on education, both for adults and children. And he's going to focus on bettering the environment, ending discrimination, and overall lifting people out of poverty, okay? Because it is in the United States' best interest that no one's in poverty, because the more money people make, the more taxes we get, and the more then economic good comes from it for everybody, okay? So everybody improves when the poor isn't poor. And he's going to fund preschool education, that's the Head Start program. He is going to try and create laws that protect the environment, like air and water environment, and consumer safety, like car safety, during this time period. Most of those laws are going to be made, but they're really not going to be supported. And they're on the books, they're written down, they're just not going to be pushed. And then he's also going to create the National Endowment for the Arts, which is PBS, Public Broadcasting System. So where in the world did Big Bird come from? Well, President Johnson with PBS. So if you really like Sesame Street, which I know is now on HBO, but originally it was on PBS. If you really like Arthur, maybe I should change this to Arthur, or I don't know, whatever else is on PBS. Daniel Tiger. And so that's all from Johnson. Now, in that, the greatest keystone parts of the Great Society is going to be Medicare and Medicaid. Both of these things are still in existence today. Medicare is hospital insurance for the elderly, because we care about our old people. And then Medicaid, okay, because people that are in need have aid, okay, is going to be insurance, medical insurance for the poor and the disabled. And those are still in existence. Both Medicare and Medicaid are still in existence today, thanks to Johnson. He's also going to change the immigration policies. In the 1920s, we created this huge restriction of who was allowed to immigrate into the United States. And it was very restrictive to anybody from Asian countries and only allowed people from Northern or from Western European countries. This new shift is going to allow more people from other European nations, as well as more people from the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, into the United States. Okay, but it's still going to be a quota system, a limited number, a limitation of eligible people moving into the United States, immigrating. So, what did you learn?